It's my pleasure to introduce you again to Representative Marilyn Strickland.
I want to thank GridWise Alliance for hosting the 2024 gridCONNEXT conference and bringing all the innovative stakeholders to this room. And we know that we are here today to discuss ways to deliver energy that is more secure, more reliable, more resilient, and more affordable. Over the last year, the Biden administration has taken up action to ensure that our grid is ready for a clean energy future. And they've continued to implement the bipartisan infrastructure law. Money is now in states, and that money is being pushed out. Over the summer, the Department of Energy offered $2.2 billion to 8 projects across 18 states that will help expand and strengthen the grid. And these funds will help build more than 600 miles of new transmission lines and upgrade about 400 miles of existing lines so they can carry more current.
And I believe we have our next speaker here. Oh, there you are. Great. Welcome. Come on forward. You're all mic'd up? Great.
Yet, but
It's
hot.
Oh, believe me,
Okay.
it's hot. Good to see you. It's my pleasure to introduce you again to Representative Marilyn Strickland. We know her because she is the co-chair of the Grid Innovation Caucus in the House. She represents the 10th District in Washington, which is the area just below Seattle with Tacoma and Olympia. She was the former mayor, two-term mayor of Tacoma, and the CEO of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say, because this is an exciting time, and we've been exploring the changes that are coming both in the grid and in Washington, and we look forward to your insights.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you for the introduction. The other thing that you also forgot to mention, that as mayor of Tacoma, Tacoma Public Utilities was also part of the portfolio, and so I'm a little familiar with generation, transmission, and distribution. I want to thank GridWise Alliance for hosting the 2024 gridCONNEXT conference and bringing all the innovative stakeholders to this room. And we know that we are here today to discuss ways to deliver energy that is more secure, more reliable, more resilient, and more affordable. I serve as co-chair of the bipartisan Grid Innovation Caucus, and in that role, we are trying to find ways to leverage private sector innovation so that we can modernize our grid. We don't have to build everything from scratch. There are things that we can do to make transmission more efficient and more effective. I also believe that as we look at our grid and what we need to do, we know that there are many things that this affects. This affects quality of life for people every single day. We want to make sure that our residential and commercial ratepayers are getting good value for the energy that they're receiving. We also know that this is a national security issue. We want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to modernize as quickly as we can. Over the last year, the Biden administration has taken up action to ensure that our grid is ready for a clean energy future. And they've continued to implement the bipartisan infrastructure law. Money is now in states, and that money is being pushed out. And we also want to make sure that we're addressing the climate crisis, but doing it in a way that is thoughtful and responsible. To get a more reliable and cleaner electrical grid and accommodate the demand, a lot of us have data centers that are coming up in our states. And as you know, data centers use a lot of energy and a lot of power. We want to make sure that we're able to meet the demands. And it's clear that this administration recognizes that significant federal investment in R&D and the U.S. transportation grid is essential to make this happen. Over the summer, the Department of Energy offered $2.2 billion to 8 projects across 18 states that will help expand and strengthen the grid. And these funds would help build more than 600 miles of new transmission lines and upgrade about 400 miles of existing lines so they can carry more current. I know the senator was just here, and I'm sure that he talked about permitting reform and how essential that is in trying to upgrade and modernize our grid. But that's why we're here today. I'm here to offer our support. Later on this afternoon, I will have a meeting with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and we will talk about this very topic as well. So we want to continue to be proactive in pursuing what we need to do. We want to be mindful of all the partners here. We want to make sure that energy in the United States remains reliable, affordable, and we know that so much depends on our ability to do this job well. So thank you very much for having me here today, and if you'd like, I can answer a few questions.
Yes, I think there will be questions from the audience. I have a couple questions. First,
Okay.
you serve on the Armed Services Committee, and also you mentioned Transportation and Infrastructure. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, beyond the permitting issues that T&I are going to take up, if there, we have this convergence of transportation and electrification.
Yeah.
If there's things that we should be looking for in the is it the 19th Congress, 119th Congress
Yeah.
next year, in terms of the agenda of the T&I committee, where there are grid implications, and I would say the same thing for armed services.
Yeah, so we plan to discuss that today in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And what I say to folks is this: regardless of who's in the White House, regardless of who has a majority in the House or Senate, our responsibility to deliver for the American people does not change. Now, we may not agree on the exact steps to get there, but at the end of the day, we want reliable power, reliable energy that is affordable to as many people as possible, and our commercial partners as well. And so I don't have the exact details of how the Trump administration will treat this or the House majority, but I do believe that there's enough bipartisan support to do this work. We want a strong economy, we support national security, and that should be something that is a nonpartisan issue.
Great, thanks. And I have one more question, prerogative here, which is based on your experience as mayor. One of the things that we do at Gridwise Alliance is to try to create educational materials and a setting for educating policymakers about the kinds of investments that have to be made in the grid in order to support policy outcomes and a reliable, affordable, and secure grid.
Yeah.
Are there things that we can do now to work with mayors and others who have municipal utilities that would be useful from your perspective?
Yeah, so when you look at local government, and whether it's public utility or even a private utility, the number one overriding factor is always going to be, how does it affect my ratepayers? And you know that utilities are run on a cost of service model. So if we make a big capital investment, or if we do something, we have to raise rates to pay for them. So I think there's always going to be a balance. But this is where the federal government can come in. We know that as a country, our infrastructure is woefully underfunded. And by passing the bipartisan infrastructure bill, by passing the Inflation Reduction Act, our goal has always been the long game. Let's have these 5-year plans, let's push money out to states, let's actually do the work, and then we come back to renew them. And so I think my ask right now for local government is, if you have the money and you received it from the state, spend it as quickly as possible so that we can demonstrate that this money is going to good use.
Great, and I'll just tell you that we put out a grid modernization index every few years where we look at ranking the states, and so we're in the process of doing the data collection. It'll be a much deeper, broader data collection than we've ever done before because of this huge change that we're going through and this injection of billions of dollars of federal funds that will hopefully catalyze a lot of change. So this will be like a baseline year for us.
And one of the things I often talk about, and before I got into politics, my profession was communication. And we're here, we're wonky, we're technical, we talk in all these terms, and the general public has no idea what we're talking about half the time, probably 80% of the time. So as we communicate, we have to do it in terms that people understand. This will keep your utility bill low. This will make sure that if there's a power outage in a storm, they can bring things back up quickly. But using terms that regular people can relate to is how we get more support for these investments.
Great, thank you. Questions from the audience? Larry?
Did you have a question, sir?
We're waiting for the mic.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
You're looking around.
Believe me, Larry has questions.
I was getting in trouble for not waiting for the microphone.
Oh, that's okay. All right.
Representative Strickland, pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Larry Beckedel, Portland General Electric, just south. But I do now have a home in your area, so it's nice to meet my representative. So pleasure. Thanks for coming and taking the time. So you mentioned you're on the Grid Innovation Bipartisan
The
Committee.
Bipartisan Grid Innovation Caucus.
How can we help you? What is it that, as you think about innovation for the grid, and this organization represents that,
Yeah.
what is it that we could do for you?
Well, thank you for that question. So his question is, what can we do for you as a member of Congress in a place that moves at the speed of a glacier? And I would say this: if you have great ideas and you're representing a private sector entity, talk about how this can speed up the ability to deliver what we need. If you're representing a utility, whether public or private, talk about the need for these investments and how they are useful. Because again, we pass these bills with the intention of demonstrating this is what happens when the federal government actually takes the time to make investments, whether it's R&D or infrastructure, and then telling the story of how it works and saying, we need you to re-up this. And if you have ideas about how we can speed up processes, I think that's incredibly important too. We will never compromise safety, But I think sometimes the government needs a bit of a push to say we can do this much more better and much more efficiently.
Questions? Tanuj here.
Microphone is on its way.
Thanks, Rep. Strickland. I'm curious to get a take on FERC, and I'd be curious to understand what the caucus think FERC does well and maybe does less well as we think about this inflection point we're at.
Yeah, I mean, we think about regulatory agencies, and depending on the administration, they have the responsibility of oversight to make sure that bad things aren't happening, and depending on administration, they have the responsibility of making sure that things are expedited. And so I would say that as we think about FERC and its regulatory role and what we need to do, again, we will never compromise safety. We want to make sure that there's opportunity, but I always talk about how coming from local government, where things move very quickly and we get things done, there's always room to do things better and more efficiently without compromising what it is we're trying to protect.
Questions? Mike? Mark?
I'll ask a question.
And can you tell me who you're with when you ask your question?
Thank you so much, Representative, for all you're doing on the grid. It's important to everybody in this country.
Yeah, and it's not the sexiest topic in the world when I show up at
come
a
on.
meeting
No,
and
no,
say,
wait.
I'm working on
In
infrastructure.
this group, it is
Yeah.
the sexiest topic in the
Yeah,
world.
not going to get you on CNN every
That's-
weekend, but it's essential to our lives.
You know, as a former Fed of 8 years, there's-
Mark Gabriel with.
I'm Mark Gabriel with United Power. I
Okay.
used to run the Western Area Power Administration.
Okay.
He's the chair of our board.
And get to be the chairman of this great group. As a former Fed, when I hear things about Schedule F and what that's going to do to potentially for federal employees, how do we protect the folks that dedicate
I
themselves?
don't know what Schedule F is.
That's the ability of the administration to remove people who have civil service standings.
Oh,
So if you don't, I would strongly suggest you take a look at it, because a lot of folks, including people in this room, who have dedicated their careers to the federal government,
Yeah.
and now they stand at great risk.
yeah, so it's interesting. Whenever there's conversation about streamlining and improving government, we're all like, yes, we could be better. But arbitrarily removing people does not help the cause. And what I worry about here is that there are people who are now serving as civil servants in government who show up every day and do the work regardless of who the administration is, and that they may feel demoralized or afraid and say, I'm out of here. And one of the things that I often say to federal employees is, we need you to stay in here and do the work. Because administrations change, members of Congress change, but the people actually keeping things going are the ones who are putting in the time. And I'm not saying that every single person who works in government is always the most efficient worker, but those are things that we need to manage through evaluations and how we help people be better workers. But this idea of arbitrarily getting rid of departments or people just because I want to streamline government and I'm going to do a 20% reduction, that's irresponsible. The question is always, what's the goal? What's the desired outcome? What are the staffing needs we have? What kind of expertise do we need, and how do we get there?
Really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have one back there.
Question?
Hi.
Hi, Representative. Thanks for coming. My name's Chris Murray. I'm with Poterra LLC, but I do a lot of advising with the military. Wanted to get your views on your caucus and
Which caucus?
National Grid Innovation Caucus.
Okay.
She's on a number of caucuses.
Yeah, I thought you were
didn't
going to say like the
list her
Democrats,
multiple-
Armed Services.
Right, right.
I'd like to get your views as a member of Congress
Yeah.
on DOD.
On
in
DOD?
Department of Defense. In working with them, there's three important things that this is a joke, but it's a bad joke, but there's three important things to always remember when working with DOD. The first is energy resilience, and I can't remember the other two. And working with DOD, I've learned that most folks in the energy community aren't DOD experts, but DOD has a ridiculous need for energy resilience. They have test beds called installations all around the country. They have billions in R&D budgets every year that no one often focuses on. So wanted to see what, if any, overlay your agenda might have with Department of Defense, grid innovation as it pertains to national security on DoD land?
Great, well, thank you. That's a really good question. So his question is that he works with the Department of Defense, and sometimes it's challenging to do some of the work that we want to do with grid innovation and energy, working with the Department of Defense. Today on the floor, we will approve an $863 billion defense bill. And as you know, it's called the National Defense Authorization Act, and that bill works really hard. It does a lot. I represent Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State, one of the largest military installations in the country, and that particular base is actually a test site for a lot of clean energy things. I mean, there's McChord Air Base and everything they're trying to do on post. And so as far as the nexus between this work and DoD, it is very, very clear and important. And here's why. Outgoing Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin declared climate change a national security issue. And so we're trying to make bases more efficient, but also understanding how climate change around the world affects everything. It affects food security and people migrating. It affects people wanting to go to different places in the world. It can be very, very destabilizing with how it affects people. And so as we look at the nexus between DoD and the work that we're trying to do in the Grid Innovation Caucus, you heard me say when I first introduced myself, I said, this is a national security issue, and we need innovative grid solutions to help us be more ready and more able to keep our nation and the world secure. So I do see a nexus behind it, but as you know, having worked with the Pentagon, things don't move as quickly, again, as they should. So how do we find ways to perhaps look at DoD and have experts in there, whether it's through the Corps of Engineers or some function whose job is to make sure that we're looking at grid innovation as part of the portfolio of the work that DoD does. Because I think sometimes DoD has a mission, and then we need other things to overlay it, and sometimes it's better to